Hello there, and welcome to Sacred Jedi Texts, the Star Wars only book club. I am Zach Russo, and with me are, as always, Andy and Ted. For this podcast, we are focusing on the Disney-era Star Wars novels, and I know for any Star Wars fan, it's an exciting time to be digging into these novels because we're focused on the new High Republic series. Today we're going to be talking about the second installment. I think technically it's the second installment. I know that I think Justina Ireland has a book out as well, but Claudia Gray put out the second installment of called Into the Dark, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Really fun book. I enjoyed it, but we'll talk more about that. But first, Andy, Ted, how you guys doing today?
I've had better days.
I'm doing okay, but I feel for Andy. I know he's not having the best day, but we're gonna get through this. We're gonna talk some Star Wars here and have a good time.
Excited to talk Star Wars.
Yeah. Well, everything will be better once we actually start talking about Star Wars. Full disclosure, Andy has had about an hour and a half worth of technical issues that we've been trying to work through. Hey, we're gonna have a great discussion, and none of that is gonna matter.
That's right.
Awesome.
We are all the Republic.
We are all the Republic. I was pretty disappointed to not hear that in this book.
Yeah, not enough chance in this book. We didn't get any. We are the Nihil. We are all children of the Force, or we are all the Republic. Yeah, pretty disappointing.
Yeah, there's
Hope
no
we get
identity
more chants.
politics.
That chants are central to Star Wars. I have spoken. Let's see. This
At
is the
least
way.
mantras.
Stuff like that.
Maybe not chants, but
not
mantras,
necessarily chants, but things that you can chant. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I was supposed to go to Tashi Station for power converters.
Exactly.
Mantra.
Yep.
Well, so guys, what did you think about Into the Dark? As the second installment in this new High Republic era and High Republic series, how did it deliver for you? Ted, why don't you start?
Well, it was a more intimate story than Light of the Jedi. Light of the Jedi felt more to me like, if you want to compare it to Marvel, like an Avengers level kind of team up. Even though we are just getting introduced to everybody, there are a lot of people and a lot of things going on at the same time. In this one, it's more intimate. You really get to know specific characters more. And it's happening concurrently with Light of the Jedi, which is nice. So you get some of those threads that happen in Light of the Jedi and their effects on other people and other places in the galaxy. But I did like the intimate nature of it. There were some moments where it struggled, specifically with a kind of side plot that we'll talk about later on. But I did enjoy that it was more intimate and we got to really know these characters. And I think, at least to me, it seems like they're setting up these characters to be really central to future Star Wars stories.
I agree. Andy, how about yourself?
Yeah, I'll quote Yoda on this one. Page turner, it was not, but I did enjoy it. A lot of the stuff in this story in particular, I think, is how does it connect to the greater story being told in the High Republic era? That's what kept me interested in this. But in terms of the overall plot, what just kind of happens in this book, not a lot really does happen. And it's hard to get into it where there are parts of the book where you expect something big to happen and maybe nothing really that big all that happens. You don't really learn a lot in this one, unlike the last book. And I will agree with you, Zach. This is kind of like book number 2, even though that there are other, media out there. There's the younger adult book as well. Mm-hmm. Or what's that? It's a youth novel.
YA
the
novel.
Justine.
Oh, no, it is a youth novel. Yeah, this is a YA novel.
This is young A. But to that point too, this felt like the most YA Star Wars novel I've read in a while. And I can't wait to see where it goes next. So I enjoyed this for what it was, but I could have gotten more out of it, I think. And I'm glad we're going to get more books later on. But this one so far wasn't my favorite. of the High Republic era.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I definitely I think this felt very much like a B story to Light of the Jedi. You know, it happens at the same time. It's just another set of events that happens during this, disaster of the Legacy run. I mean, it was fun. I mean, there's fun events that happened, but I do feel like it was more of a stepping stone to continue, and to really a setup and to continue to be able to continue the story with a wider universe, than we already have. It's just more exposition to set the universe before we really dig into the events that will eventually lead to the resolution of the High Republic. So, yeah, I agree. It wasn't my favorite, certainly wasn't my favorite Claudia Gray novel. Not my favorite High Republic novel thus far, even though there's only 2 of them. So, I mean, it's not a huge comparison. But I like this era a lot. It's really fun to see a lot of, and Claudia Gray does a great job at this, is making her stories incredibly meta, and how the perspectives of her characters kind of expose the in particular, like the Jedi of this time. So it was really cool to see some of that stuff. But speaking of Claudia Gray, I know we kind of touched on, Light of the Jedi a little bit, but what are your thoughts on, the writing style from Claudia Gray versus Charles Soule? Obviously it's a different type of novel. This is a young adult novel versus, a fully fleshed out novel. But, for me, I'll start off by saying, it didn't keep me as engaged as Light of the Jedi. I thought it was a little, the point of views of the characters were a little disorganized. When you read a chapter book, right, you kind of expect to have one point of view, not necessarily per chapter, but you can tell where one leaves off and one picks up. And I thought it was kind of hard for me to keep track of which point of view we're looking at, from all the different characters that we see. So that was probably one of my biggest critiques of the book in terms of writing style. But I'm curious to see what you guys thought.
I can agree with that, that it was kind of hard to tell whose POV it was from, and especially too because there were moments where a sequence was occurring and you'd have one person in one place and one person in another, and then they'd kind of meet up. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, there was another person doing something else at the same time as well. And it did split off a lot, like Light of the Jedi did, but it was also, like I said earlier, a little more intimate, because at least these characters are experiencing different things at the same place and together, and they come together. In Light of the Jedi, it was a little different because you'd have so many different settings going back and forth between one Jedi to another Jedi, to the Nihil, back to another Nihil storm, back to John Rowe, then over to Avar Kriss, and that ended up working. Like I said, it was kind of like Avengers level as far as like the scale of the disaster, like what we got from the disaster, what the Jedi did, and how many were there. But I don't know. It was hard to tell whose POV it was, especially because not that it has to every time, but a lot of times they'd start in somebody else's POV describing something happening without telling you who it was happening to. And sometimes it was difficult to tell because some of these characters are experiencing similar things, if not the same thing at the same time. So I can definitely agree with that.
I didn't have the same experience while listening to it. I thought it was pretty easy to keep track of the POV, but I see now that you guys are talking about it, how it could be confusing at times. Like I said, wasn't my experience when reading. I will say, though, in terms of like how this book was written, definitely a little jarring after reading Light of the Jedi. Just different writing styles. Claudia Gray writes differently than Charles Soule. Is it better, worse? Not really sure how to compare in this case. But like, if I'll go to one of my favorite novels of Claudia Gray, which is the Leia, Princess of Alderaan book, I absolutely love that book. And I don't see the same style captured in that. And I wouldn't be able to identify what it is or what about the story she's telling in it. It just didn't seem the same to me. Definitely, it was a different take on writing in the Star Wars galaxy that if you had not told me it was Claudia Gray, I might not even know it was Claudia Gray who wrote it. So I don't know if that's about necessarily the style itself. Maybe it's just these particular characters, this point in time in the story, because I'm assuming she's writing another book too. Like she'll have her kind of sequel novel to this. So I expect that maybe that next one I might like more so, but I don't know if it's a stylistic thing. I can't, pinpoint anything. You guys talked about POV. From my perspective, my POV, I'm not really seeing anything. But maybe it is about how Claudia just wrote this one.
Yeah, I mean, one notable absence from this book that is kind of different from her other books is there's not a real central romance in this story. She tries to kind of put the Nan and the Reath thing together, but it's not really a romance, which is a far departure from her other stories that we've read. There's a really centralized romance story going on within the plot. Whether it be Leia and what's his name from Bloodlines. I can't remember, but
I can't remember his name, but I know.
And then from the other, it doesn't matter right now, but there are that story, and that's one thing that I saw as a notable difference from this book. And I don't know that it's necessarily a good or a bad thing, but it definitely departed from her normal writing. From what I saw there. So, but anyway, speaking of which, let's dig into some of these characters. So as Ted mentioned, I feel like I connected to these characters a little better than I did the characters in Light of the Jedi, just because it was more intimate. It was more, it didn't jump around as much as given my critique of the POV, there was still a pretty linear story happening throughout this, and so we were able to connect to the main characters throughout this entire book. So the main characters we have are some of the Jedi we see are Reath Silas, Master Comac, Orla, and Dez, and I really like these Jedi. And really all of the Jedi in the High Republic era. I think it's so refreshing from what we've seen in the other eras of Star Wars. They really make sure that that this is a different Jedi Order, than what we've seen in. I don't know if I should say past or future iterations of the Jedi, but from the ones that we've seen already, So what do you guys think of these Jedi and any particulars of the characters themselves?
Well, Reath Silas, I kind of like that he's described as sort of unremarkable as far as his ability with the Force, but more of a student of the Jedi and the Force, and he wants to be an archivist, so that's a departure from other characters we see in some of these stories, where he kind of seems like he's very comfortable on Coruscant at home doing his thing, and he's not a coward, but he's also just kind of a creature of comfort and does not want to go beyond the scope of the things that he's become familiar with. Comac was really interesting to me because he gives me kind of Qui-Gon Jinn vibes in a certain sense.
Totally.
He's not quite Qui-Gon Jinn, because I think Qui-Gon is more on the nose with his desire to kind of branch off in different ways from the teachings of the Jedi and what they do and what they practice. Comac, you can just feel everything surging within him. Like, why do we do this way? why has this been done this way so long, and why can't we bend a little bit? Why can't we feel anything? What are these things that are keeping the Jedi from expanding their learning? So he's really interesting from that standpoint. Orla was less interesting to me, I think, than any of them, just because she has a fairly small arc, and we'll get into that later. Her arc more pertains to that kind of side story, that 25 years in the past story. Wasn't a big fan of her. And then Dez was kind of interesting too, because he seems like I don't know, like the popular guy. He's very likable. Everybody wants to be around him. He's very gifted. And he just seems like the kind of Jedi that can do no wrong, essentially, like very well-rounded Jedi that everybody wants to be around and everybody wants to be like. So they had a nice mix of different personalities that I really enjoyed in this.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think I can get by all of these Jedi. Like, I can follow their stories, even Orza,
Orla.
Is that how?
Orla.
Yeah. The character, I think we just don't get like enough of her, and really where I think the true character development comes through actually is in the subplot C, which is all forgettable. So like, you take this character who she does some of the coolest things, I think, in subplot C, but you don't really get that in the main storyline with her. So I think it's hard to maybe make that connection with the character, but I think all the other is like, especially Reath. He's the character I identify the most with when I'm reading this one. Creature of habit, likes to study, like those types of things. I seen a Jedi, I go, oh, that's like the kind of Jedi maybe that I would be. I might not be good at the Force, but I would be definitely the one that would be willing to pick up the book and get into the Jedi archives and all of those things. So I can see him. And then Master Comac too. I like the Qui-Gon Jinn comparison. I think we're going to get more of that. I don't think we're done with it. This was like the introduction to Qui-Gon, and then they offed Qui-Gon in the first movie. In this instance, spoiler, we get Comac through the end of this book, and we're probably going to see more of him. And I think we're going to try to like dance around those same questions or things that Qui-Gon was doing 200 years later, to deal with the issues of the Jedi. Like, we're going to start seeing things. And it's talked about, like, later on, his kind of interest in the dark side. And I think that's going to be a really important thing going forward. Ultimately, probably the thing that will lead to why Qui-Gon has his questions later on in The Phantom Menace.
Yeah, that's a great call out. I mean, Comac kind of it seems like he kind of sets the seed for that kind of Qui-Gon Jinn type Jedi. But even given that, I mean, we see a lot more flexibility within this iteration of the Jedi Order than we do in the the Republic era and even the Rebellion era Jedi. I guess it's all more the Republic era, but regardless, they're not necessarily dissuaded from exploring their own paths. Like Orla, for example, is a way seeker. She's decided to kind of part ways from the Jedi Order, at least temporarily, to figure out where she fits within the Force. And to me, that's really compelling. That's probably the most compelling part of her character, in the limited exposure she gets, is that she's the one that's kind of willing to stick her neck out, and she'll cooperate with the Jedi, but she's trying to figure everything out for herself. And then Comac kind of almost takes her lead. And Orla has to be the one to kind of hold him back at one point and kind of ground him a little bit more after the events that happen. He's really kind of questioning where he fits in the Force, where the Jedi fit in the Force. Do the Jedi have a right to put a hard line between the light side and the dark side? And just, these characters do a great job at exposing those types of, those types of I don't want to say discrepancies, but maybe differences, between the different Jedi orders. Okay, so let's get back into our Jedi discussion here. I did want to bring up Reath Silas before we move on, because Reath is kind of the the main character. He's the who we follow through the story for the most part, even though I think, to Claudia's credit, she does a pretty good job at including the other characters and exposing their arcs as well. But I'm excited to see where Reath Silas goes after this story. I think that he can be a really interesting character if they decide to keep going with his character and include him as a main part of the saga. He had a pretty major character arc and some pretty major character growth throughout this story. From starting from the Jedi who really doesn't want to leave his comfort zone. He's the worker versus the natural talent, and he ends up kind of being the hero, or one of the heroes of the events that happen, and he's just kind of thrown into the fire, and he takes it, and he succeeds, and he excels under pressure, which he didn't think he could do. So I really, really like his arc, and I hope they continue it, because I found him to be one of the more interesting characters from this saga so far. So apart from the Jedi, we have a few other characters who I love the crew of the vessel. Really, really fun characters. We have Affie, Leox, and my favorite new character, Geode, who is basically a rock. It doesn't speak, doesn't move, but Claudia Gray does an awesome job at making him a character.
But he does. He does do those things.
Well,
he just doesn't do them in the book. We don't ever see it happen.
Maybe it's so hard to tell. She really toes the line of, is he or isn't he? So Claudia does a great job at kind of towing that line of you keeping the reader guessing, is this just a figment of these people's imagination? Are they just towing a rock around with them, or is he really a sentient being? And even Geode, who really doesn't do much outside, the other characters give him actual character, otherwise he doesn't have any. He still gets an arc. It's awesome. I just love Geode. I think he's one of the coolest parts of this book. She does an awesome job at it. And then we have, Affie and Leox as well, but I'll let you guys go off on that. Ted, you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, with Geode, you think where it's gonna end up, because it would be disappointing if it didn't. But it's just a fun game that they play, where it almost seems like Affie and Leox are just screwing with everybody on the ship. They tow this rock around and they talk to it and they say it gives them coordinates and all this other stuff, and it's doing all these things, and that they're having conversations with it. And Reath is questioning the entire time whether it's real or not, and he's like, I don't feel anything in the force from this thing. And I just love how that it plays with it the entire time, and how it ends up as well. And if we want to talk about Affie and Leox, they're great characters themselves. Affie has quite the arc, which I really enjoy, where she finds out a lot about her family, her birth parents. She finds out a lot about Scover Bine, who runs the Bine Guild, who is her foster parent, and how those two things intersect, both her parents' deaths and Scover. But on top of that, the empathy that she ends up showing toward different people, the growth that she has, and the quick turnaround from one possible resolution to her arc to the one that ends up being the right one in the very end. I really enjoyed how even though it is kind of jarring, I enjoyed that it just goes immediately from one to the other. It's like, good. I was almost going to be disappointed if you went with the thing you were thinking about at first. Then Leox doesn't really have an arc, but he's just a fun character who's always there, very supportive of everybody. He seems super woke, which is pretty fun. He seems like down for pretty much anything. He's androgynous, which is really interesting. And, you know, he enjoys the occasional spice stick. What's the big deal? He's a chill dude. If you could characterize him into anybody, and like both between the voice and the way he looks, I think you guys would agree. It's like Matthew McConaughey from Dazed and Confused, except not creepy toward young girls.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the opposite. He
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's androgynous. So, yeah, absolutely. Androgynous and celibate, and that's great.
I don't know if he's androgynous or celibate, actually. I think he more would be identified as like a demisexual or asexual for his sexual preference.
Yeah,
that's fair. That's fair.
I don't think they'd talk about his gender identity at all within it, but definitely like probably like the most woke character we've gotten in, like we've introduced homosexual characters before in Star Wars. This is the first time we had someone who was not on that typical what the expected spectrum is, someone more like that, and then his just like whole philosophy on everything. So he's probably my favorite character we've had in Star Wars in a very long time. I can't wait to see more of him because this was like the introduction. Like, yes, he doesn't really have character growth because his purpose is more to serve as like the mentor, wisdom figure, gets them where they need to go because he's the captain of this ship, right? Kind of fills almost in a lot of ways like a Han Solo type role too, where although he doesn't have the same character development, he's there to serve a purpose for the other characters so that they can have their development. The other characters, I'm blanking on her name again, Affy. Yeah, I like her a lot. I like how her story opens up the High Republic era to what the guilds are doing, what these other sorts of people, not the Jedi, not the, obviously not Sith, not Nihil, not the bad guys, but like the everyday people, like the people with jobs and like are working. As it turns out, it's more than that. We get to talk about indentured servitude. We get to talk about slavery in the Star Wars galaxy. And we know the consequences because in the future, when we get to the Phantom Menace, we meet two slaves, Shmi Skywalker and Anakin Skywalker. Though we know like the consequences of what Affy's doing right now aren't going to lead to better things. In fact, we know that slavery is going to continue to exist in the galaxy. I like that. Geode, I hated it.
You did?
Absolutely hated it.
No.
Up until the
You're
big
breaking
moment.
My heart.
No. So I get there. I get there at the end, but I could not stand. Anytime it got brought up, I was like, this stupid rock. I don't care if it's sentient or not. Like, why do we keep doing this? It's not funny anymore. It's just annoying that it keeps getting brought up. But there's a moment where it's like, yeah, he's definitely sentient, and it comes all together. Is when he saves, Reath from death.
Yeah.
And so like that was the redeeming moment. I was like, thank you for actually doing something with this and not ever serving this plot. Like this was going to be not a plot hole, but just like a dumb thing that got referenced and never really addressed. Claudia Gray, shoots it out of the park with getting this not real character to save the main character. So like totally redeemed at the end, but during all the build up to it, I was like, what the fuck, this thing again? Like, here we go.
Dude, I couldn't disagree more. I loved it. Like even to
I like the running joke
towards the end of the book, like I remember Leox said something and he was like, but Geo gave him a break and it would be the only break that he would get. It's just I loved it. I thought it was so funny because like it's just a play on he's a rock. He's a freaking rock, and that's it. But like you said, it came to fruition at the end when and it made it all even better. So good. Yeah, just to touch on the other two characters real quick from my perspective. I loved Affy. I thought her character was really cool. I thought that her resolution, and kind of the conscience play that she had to go through, from figuring out what the Bind Guild's involvement with this station that they end up on is. When she figures it out, she has to debate on what she's going to do, because she knows it's not right. And Ted, to your point, we see that real conflict, right up until the end. What's going to happen with this Bind Guild, and she makes the right choice. So I really liked her. Her motivation was super clear the whole time. And really, I think she was just there to expose the, and to kind of world build a little bit, to your point, Andy, and involve the rest of the galaxy, especially, in the frontier and the outer rim, kind of what they're doing, in this kind of new part of the galaxy at this point in time. So that was really neat. Leox is definitely one of my favorite characters that has been brought into this universe now. I mean, he's just so chill, and I think he enjoys a little more than the occasional spice stick, Ted, but he's just so cool and chill, and I love him. There's really he's just there to serve a purpose too, but great crew, man. I love the crew of the Vessel. I thought they were such a great addition to this book.
Well, I think you're leaving out something there.
Yeah,
the Vessel.
The Vessel is the Vessel.
Yeah, it is a character. The Vessel is the name of the ship, and that's something like in Star Wars too. You get the Millennium Falcon; it's its own character. We learn in a whole movie that it's got a droid named L3 that's part of the computer that actually makes it a character. But I like that the Vessel is a thing. Like Affy and Leox, they really care about this ship in particular. It's not the best ship that the guild owns by any means. In fact, it's like this tiny little freighter thing that, when our Jedi are first introduced to it, like, this is the ship that we're going, to the place in, and they're like, oh, okay, I guess we're riding in this thing. But it's a character that exists, and I can't wait till we reintroduce it, in later books, and be like, oh yeah, that's the Vessel, off doing its thing.
Yeah. I really hope that they do use these characters in a more effective way in the future, including the Vessel. I think that they've set this up for a reason, and I expect them to continue it, but I really hope that they use it effectively.
Yeah, I can see some offshoot stories with just this crew doing their own thing outside of involvement with the Jedi. But just really quickly, I like that they essentially named the Vessel the equivalent of Bodie McBoatface. Just right on the nose. It's a vessel. Calling it Vessel. Love it.
That is awesome. Cool. So, there's a couple other characters that we can just briefly touch on. Nan and Haig are the kind of the other characters that get introduced, and I don't want to spend too much time on them because I'm sure we'll get into it during our plot discussion. But Nan is a young girl, younger than Reath Silas and Affy, who are around the same age, and they're the ones that kind of we find out more malicious intent from these two as the story goes on. They end up being a bit of a antagonist throughout this story, even though they're kind of initially set up as just another companion. So it was kind of cool to see their growth. And we learn a little bit more about the Nihil through Nan, and to a lesser extent Haig as well. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but anything of note from you guys on these two?
Not really.
Go ahead, Ted.
I was just going to say, I think we'll get into it as the plot discussion goes, because like you said, we find out some things about them, and I think going chronologically with that would probably make more sense, but I don't know if Andy has anything.
Well, I'm just going to say that, I saw it coming, these characters, the reveal here, of what's going to happen with them. And I'll say this is a weakness potentially going forward, because this is twice now where I've figured out who the baddie was in their introduction. With Marchion Ro in the last book, the person over the speaker who was like saying that like, oh, go help these people out. I was like, that's Marchion Ro. Like, he's setting this up. He's getting them to, fall for his plan. It's like the introduction of Nan. They're talking about her ship, right? And what it looks like. And the way they're describing it is like a Nihil ship. And I'm like, okay, so they're Nihil. And they're just like hiding amongst them to not get, caught or get intel or something, right? To service the Nihil story. And so sure enough, when it was revealed, I was like, okay, yeah, like I saw that coming. So I hope that this isn't a continuing trend where they're just very obvious kind of reveals or twists within these stories. But we'll talk about it when we get into the plot stuff. So I'll save it for then.
Yeah. I will say really quickly that the reveal of Marchion Ro being the person on the comm is more of an audiobook problem, where they made the decision to use a certain cadence and certain voice that matched his, and that's why it's obvious. I think if you're reading it, you probably don't have a clue unless you're just thinking way ahead and thinking, is this guy the type that's going to have all these different strings being pulled at the same time? But I do agree with the one in this one.
Yeah, good point, Ted. I didn't even think of the audiobook factor there. That's what we talked about the last time too. But this is nothing to do with the audiobook. It's literally the, what's happening on the page. Yeah. They're telling you right there.
Yeah, it is. But I don't think it's necessarily it has to be hidden. I think that there's intentional details that Claudia gives you to lead you to the inevitable conclusion of where these characters end up. So I understand what you're saying. Like it was a very predictable twist. But again, I think that it's in the wide scope of the galaxy. There's so much going on, especially with the Nihil, that I don't think this necessarily has to be the main, like the big Shyamalan twist that you might expect. So I didn't really hate it that much because I felt the same way. I was like, oh, of course these are Nihil, but I didn't dislike it. I didn't dislike that fact. So anyway, yeah, let's get into this plot discussion. There's one more kind of group of characters that I want to bring up, but we'll kind of save that because there's not a ton to go over with them either, and that is the Drengir, who are the kind of the new. I don't even know how to describe them. We'll talk about the Drengir. Really interesting, a very intriguing group of characters that we see. Okay, so let's get into the plot details, and we'll kind of go over some of the more important things that happened within this book, and the consequential things that come out of it. Right. So we described Reath Silas as this kind of scholarly Padawan. He wants to become an archivist, and we actually get introduced to him. And his master Joramali fighting some pirate gang. Not super important. I don't really remember what happens there, but that's kind of how we get introduced to him. So it was interesting to see that right after that he's like, I don't want to leave the library. He's like, he just got out of battle. He's like, but that sucked. I want to research. So that was kind of funny to me. But what happens is, Reath is informed that Joramali took a post on Starlight Beacon, which we know is the new, space station in the Outer Rim. And again, this is all happening kind of in tandem with Light of the Jedi. So we already knew that was going on. But this is where Reath actually comes in, and he's horrified. He doesn't want to go. The last thing he wants to do is leave the archives with all of his resource materials, and go to the Outer Rim, which he has no idea what goes on out there. He just doesn't want to leave his comfort zone. So he actually ends up, Joramali leaves for, there's some stuff that happens in there, but Joramali leaves for the Starlight Beacon, and Reath stays behind to finish something up, and then he gets kind of his own transport to Starlight Beacon to follow her. And this is where we meet Des Ryden, Orla Jareni and Comac Vitus. These are all Jedi that are that are going with him to the Starlight Beacon for one reason or another. I think they all have kind of their own reasons to go. Orla is actually a way seeker. She wasn't really told to go there. That's just where she decided she wants to go, right? But when they go to the docks to get their transport, their original transport broke down, so they have to find this freelance transport ship, which is when we're introduced to the vessel. So really, right up front, we're kind of introduced to all of our main characters, within a very short amount of time, which is kind of nice because that gives us a lot of time to get to know everybody. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, one of my favorite parts about like the sequence you're describing is all of this is taking place on Coruscant, right?
Yeah.
We are getting a great description of what Coruscant is like, which in some ways is kind of sad that we didn't get more of this in the prequel trilogy. You get this in the Clone Wars for sure, but talking about like movies and other media, like this is the kind of cool stuff. You get to see like what's happening actually in the Jedi Temple, what's happening on the streets of Coruscant as they're, chasing down the pirates at the beginning. And then later on going to the docks and like just seeing all of this busyness happen. Like you get a little bit of that in the prequel trilogy. You get a lot of it in the Clone Wars. And I'm glad we're getting it in this book series, in particular this book, because Coruscant is a cool place. It's a city planet. The Jedi Temple's there. That's where the Senate is for the galaxy. So like, there are a lot of things that I'm interested in Star Wars that take place on this planet. So it's cool that we get it more fleshed out in this era, in this book.
Agreed. Yeah, it is really cool. I actually would have liked a little bit more exposition of the planet itself. We do get some exposition from these characters, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Coruscant is pretty cool. Like it's like the New York of New York City of the galaxy, and you get a little bit of that. So good call out. But so at the docks on Coruscant, they find this freelance starship called the Vessel of the Bind Guild. Again, that's where we're introduced to Leox, Affy, and Geode. And Leox is the captain of this starship. And he basically tells them like, well, you're not going to find anybody else, so it's either us or you stay here. And the Jedi are like, okay, I guess we're going on the Vessel to Starlight Beacon. And so they take off, and this is when, so they're going through hyperspace, and lo and behold, they run into some debris from the Legacy run. This is the event that kind of throws the universe into chaos. And this is just another part of the galaxy that we see this happening in. So their journey comes to an abrupt halt. They get, kind of like grazed by a piece of debris, and they have to drop out of hyperspace. And they drop out of hyperspace in this, kind of deep space, kind of middle of nowhere. There's no planets around, and hyperspace has been closed down. Like all the hyperlanes are closed, to avoid anybody else getting hit. And so they're stranded. The vessel, along with some other ships in the area, are stranded. And so,
which we learn is a result of all of the ships having the same coordinate pre-programmed into the ship to go to this location.
Yeah, touch on that a little bit, because that is kind of interesting.
Yeah, so what happens is that the Legacy run event occurs and there's debris in hyperspace. So what ends up happening is the ship needs to get out of hyperspace someplace, so like the nearest exit, essentially. And the coordinates that is already in the system for some reason. And then Leox is confused by that. Like, why are these, or it might have been Affy who was confused why the coordinates were there. But in any event, they just realized, oh, there's all of these already preset coordinates. And lo and behold, like you just said, Zach, there are other ships here too. And they all appear to be either a part of the Bind Guild or, as we'll learn, there's some other ships there that shouldn't have been there probably. Right. Or lucky to have been there.
Right. Yeah. So they all are kind of stranded here. And they actually find out that there are other ships there because they pick up, a beacon signal. And it happens to be a signal from, I don't know the name of their ship, but the ship of Nan and Haig, who we touched on a little earlier. And so they're kind of all like, all right, what do we do? Where do we go? And Leox finds out that in the system, the system star is dying. And so they're about to be hit with a solar flare, and they have to find refuge. Otherwise, all of those ships are toast. So he widens the scope a little bit. He finds this space station, and they, after some maneuvering, they get all of the ships onto the space station just in time to avoid any damage from the flare. So again, they hear that the hyperspace routes have been shut down. They're going to be stranded, and now they actually, luckily, they find refuge on this space station to kind of wait it out. But on this space station, God, some stuff happens. This is where really the meat of everything goes down. I mean, these events are really important for probably a lot of the future stories that we'll hear in this series. But so let's see. So the crew is kind of debating on what to do. Actually, let's skip that. So they get to the ship, right? They get to the space station. Everybody's on there. And let's talk about what they find on the space station. So the first thing they noticed is that, Reath actually points out that there's a lot of Amaxine warrior stuff. He kind of realizes this is a space station built by the Amaxines, who we previously see in other Claudia Gray content. I think Bloodlines is where she introduces the Amaxine warriors.
I believe so.
Yeah, and they're like these intense warrior people that that's just like their culture. Is war essentially, and so that's going to be important for later. But really interesting that she, just Claudia Gray verse, she brings it in every time. She's gonna find a way to get her stuff in there, and I love that. And this space station is just abundant with plant life. There's vines everywhere on the station, and it's actually they're all maintained by these 8T gardening droids. And the station looks abandoned, but there's still power. There's still clearly life going on in the station, even though there's nobody there.
Supposedly, there's nobody there.
So right, supposedly,
right. It's seemingly self-sustaining, is what they mention
with these 8T droids, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, like they're these droids are kind of the servants of this plant life that,
and it seems to be
going.
Abandoned. At least we think, like Andy's saying.
Yep, exactly.
And did anyone else think of like Wally with like shearing clippers on their hands? Like that's all I could picture in my head this entire time was like little Wally droids running around with shearing clippers. Just
well, I was picturing the Eva droid. Like that's just like what was in my head.
Yeah.
Like, it's got to be like this floating, floating little gardening droid.
The kind of like medium-sized floating and just very focused on its task, and that's it.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, really interesting. The 8T droids are actually kind of cool. We'll touch on what they do a little bit later. But anyway, so yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we find out about this ship. One other thing that to point out is that Affy's really interested in this stuff. She kind of because of the Bind Guild implications that have already gone on with these other ships, she actually starts to notice like there's handwritten symbols all over the place, which is highly unusual to have actual handwriting in this era. I think Comac even mentions like, I don't know the last time I've actually written anything down. It's all on the computer. So that kind of piques Affy's interest, and she actually notices that there was the logo of the Bind Guild, in on I don't know, I don't remember exactly where it was, but she noticed like the Bind Guild, and so that's another implication of the Bind Guild on this station, which is not great, for what we see in the future. And the Bind Guild is her guild that's run by her kind of adoptive mother. Her biological parents passed away, and Skovar Bine is the leader of the guild, and she kind of takes her under her wing.
Well, and is it revealed too at this point in time, like that her parents are or were a part of the guild, and that they died on a mission?
So that's they do get into that. I don't think it's right here, but yes, we end up finding out that her parents were part of the Bind Guild. That's more when we get into like the servitude part of the story. We find out that her parents are actually
well, I think that happens. Yeah, that definitely happens later. But I think like we know that like her parents at this point were like members of the guild. Like that's why, and the reason why she is the kind of like adopted child now of what's her name is that the fact that like because her parents died as part of the guild, like she kind of just adopted her.
I think yes, that's definitely part of it, but I also think they just kind of had this connection even prior to her parents dying. Affy and Skovar kind of always had this rapport, at least according to Leox. Leox kind of mentions like that she's kind of her pet, and always has been. So she has this obviously, very strong connection to the Bind Guild, and by seeing all of this stuff, it starts to concern her. What is the Bind Guild? What does the Bind Guild have to do with this station? She didn't know about it, and being the Bind Guild leader's daughter, she would think, I know everything about the Bind Guild. What is she hiding? And that becomes a major problem going forward.
And she tells that she'll make sure she asks Skovar about it when she gets back. So
exactly, she's going to confront her.
Got to have this conversation.
Yeah, she's going to confront her about it.
And at least at this point, she doesn't suspect anything from Skovar. Mm-hmm. She suspects more from others in the Bind Guild, maybe potentially planning things against Skovar behind her back.
Yep.
She's thinking there's no way Skovar would be part of any of this at the station. Like you said, that if it involves the Bind Guild, then Affy would probably know about it, and therefore Skovar would know about it too. So she's skeptical that Skovar is involved at first.
Yeah, great call out. She thinks that people are going behind her back about it.
Yep.
So there's some other things that we see too is going over to the Jedi portion of things. Orla and Comac find these statues, and they sense the dark side very prevalent on the station, and they kind of assume that it's coming from these statues. And as they're investigating a little bit, they actually both get pulled into a force vision. And Comac is sure that this is a warning from the station, from something on the station. Presumably, these statues are idols that they're investigating. It's kind of warning them to stay away, sort of thing. And we see a lot of that. There's a lot of like heady Jedi stuff that goes on this station, in terms of flashbacks and visions. Really interesting stuff. So as they kind of settle on into the station, there's a little bit of a problem between one of the other ships. I think is it the Mizzy? That there's like these looters from the Mizzy people. You guys remember the Mizzy guys?
Okay.
I remember the Mizzy. I don't think they were a problem. I think it was another ship that ended up being a problem. I think the Mizzy was just one of the people that was along with Nan and Reath when they go to investigate at the beginning.
Right, that's right. Yep.
Speaking of the issues with the other ships, that some refugees from one of the ships decide to kidnap Nan,
Right.
seemingly to use in some way or to sell into slavery. They seem to think to be used for personal uses because she's a young girl. I'm sure you can guess what's going on there.
Mm-hmm.
But she ends up getting saved by Reath, who ends up cutting off the kidnapper's arm, which is, classic Star Wars. You can't have a Star Wars story without somebody's limb getting severed by a lightsaber. So,
but that's
that
a
was
really
nice.
big moment for him too, because
Yeah.
he really struggles with I don't want to do this. I don't want to fight these guys, but this is the only way to save Nan. He really struggles with actually pulling the trigger.
Right. He is able to rationalize it, though, going back to one of the things that happens in this book a lot, by the way, is he goes back to conversations he's had with his master, Jorah Mali, and some of the lessons he's learned from her, and he kind of falls back on those when he does have doubt. In this instance, she talks about, we do not seek out violence, but we use it to protect others if need be, or protect ourselves if we are being attacked. So in this instance, he's able to rationalize, I don't like this, but somebody was being attacked and kidnapped, and this was the only way. I had to attack this guy because the guy ended up actually challenging him, saying, you don't have the nerve. I'm just going to take her. And, he did show that he had the nerve and that he could do what he needed to do in that instance.
Yeah. It's just, it's one of many examples that in Reath's character growth that he is starting to step out of his comfort zone and has the ability to, do more than he thinks he does, which is kind of cool. So after that part, I don't know if it's after, but it's somewhere around that part. It is after that part, actually. But Des and Affy and Reath and Nan, and this is the Mizzy, the other, one of the Mizzy guys, goes to scout the lower levels of the station. And during their expedition, Affy was holding on to one of the plant roots, and the 8T gardening droids come after her. They took her as a threat, and their sole purpose on this ship is to protect the plant life. And if they sense the threat of the plant life, they're gonna take action. And so they all get swarmed with these 8T droids, and they have to they have to pretty much figure out how to get past them and figure out how to escape from them. And in doing so, Affy gets scraped by one of the thorns on the vines, and ends up getting poisoned. And so Des goes back to get the antidote from the vessel, and she ends up being okay. And then Affy tells Leox, while she's on the vessel, about all the stuff that she's found about the Bind Guild. And Leox tells her that, Skovar has to know about it. There's nothing that the Bind Guild does that Skovar doesn't know about. And Affy's not happy with that answer. She is convinced that the Bind Guild is somehow maneuvering around Skovar, and the idea that Skovar has something to do with this ship and knows about it is extremely upsetting to her, because she holds her in such high regard. So then Orla and Comac are, so we haven't mentioned it yet, but they've been doing this kind of back and forth in they went through something similar 25 years ago. Right? They were Padawans at the time. They were on a mission with their masters. And I think we've all agreed at this point. I mean, maybe we've already talked about it, but it's a pretty unremarkable flashback, for the most part. So that's why we really haven't mentioned it yet, but they do reminisce on it pretty often. And so they're talking about the crisis that they went through 25 years ago, and then they get pulled into another Force vision. And Reath actually gets pulled into this Force vision as well, where he sees a Jedi attacking him, a Jedi with a blue lightsaber attacking him. And, again, this is a warning of the ship. But this one has some bigger implications on what's going to happen in the future. So these force visions are becoming more frequent, and they're convinced that these idols on the ship have to go. Like they are providing this space station with the dark side of the force.
I will point out quickly that Dez is the only one that suggests that it could possibly be the plants that are imbued with the dark side, but Comac immediately dismisses that, saying that he's dealt with plants that have dark side ability or energy around them, and this didn't feel like it. So just something to keep in mind as we go forward.
Well, and the key there too is it's sentience. So like sentient plants, like he's met them before, but like what doesn't like work like this dark side plants, nope, it's like they're just imbued with the dark side, they're not a thinking thing. So like those two things can't be going together, because this is sentient. He feels it as like a thing, like so they're as if they're being watched, there's something observing them. And we're going to find out what that is a little later on. Dez is right, it is the plant, it's a specific type of plant, the Drengir. So Exactly.
Yeah, which I'm excited to talk about. So let's get to that soon. But before that, so Dez also brings up that they need to find out what is on the lower levels. Like they didn't make it very far the last time, but Dez is like, there's got to be something else. Like we have to go see what's up in the lower levels. So they form a party, same party as last time, but this time they have to figure out like how they're going to get past the 8T droids. And Reath discovers that if they hold these potted plants, they won't be mistaken as a threat. I don't know exactly the logic here. I thought this is a kind of a weird mechanic of how to get through the 8T droids. I don't know if you guys want to jump in on that, but I thought this was kind of a weird sequence, to be honest.
Yeah, I guess the thought was that, well, if we hold the plants, they won't think we're a threat to the plants, they'll think we're plants. But then there's the possible implication that doesn't end up happening, but like, what if they just decide that those plants need pruning in that moment? It didn't make as much sense as maybe Claudia Gray thought it did as a mechanic to get by these droids, but it's really the way that they get by the AT droids is like, hey, look, we're plants, we're disguised as plants.
Yeah, I got it. I don't think it's they're disguised as plants. The idea that they're holding these, and that if something were to happen to them, then something would happen to the plants. So like they're kind of using as like a scapegoat. They can't get harmed because if we get harmed, the plants are going to get harmed.
Right.
That's fair. When I was listening to it, I couldn't wrap my head around like, okay, how does this make any sense? Like, why are they just carrying plants around, and that somehow that gets them through this? These
freaking Star Wars and their MacGuffins. Now we got plants hanging around these necks. Bring back George Lucas. He wouldn't have done these things.
Yeah, right. Oh my God, it was a strange sequence for me, but pretty small in the grand scheme of things. So, with these plants, they successfully navigate through the 8T droids, and the party splits up when they get to the lower levels. So, Affy pretty much is just like on her own. She's just doing her own research. She's now on a mission to find out what the Bind Guild has to do with this station. Like that's her only motivation through this whole thing. And so she does some more searching, and she actually, this is Andy, where she finds out that her biological parents were here. There's a reference to her parents' ship on this. I don't even know where it was, but she finds a reference to her parents' ship, which makes her even more upset. She's like, okay, so now my parents were here. There's Bind Guild stuff all over the place. Everything's just adding up to not a good outcome for the Bind Guild in Affy's eyes. And then so that's one part of the party. The other part of the party is Reath and Dez. And This is not a good part of the story. Reath and Dez go down. They find these rings, and Dez essentially is like, he's like swept up in this like rotating bookcase that like brings him into the pod. Like all I could think about was like Clue. And like it's like this secret door that just like flips him around, and now he's in this place. Reath can't see anything other than these super bright lights, and then Dez is gone. He is presumed dead, because once Reath can see, he sees that there are helix rings in there, and the helix rings are essentially they're like these super powerful. Not fuel, but
they're like boosters. They're described as like energy boosters that are filled with pure coaxium, which is a reference back to Solo. And he thinks that Dez was disintegrated by these because they're, right. I guess they superheat and then launch pods out of these tunnels.
Right. Well, and they're like super risky to use.
Yeah.
Right, we'll learn that later. Yeah. But yeah, all we see are helix rings. So he's like, well, Dez was in here and these helix rings were used. So he's thinking that Dez stumbled into this tunnel and was disintegrated, being mistaken for an escape pod, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's what I thought too. Like this was so good on them for later on coming up with a twist for this and doing something with it, because like Claudia fooled me. I thought instantly, wow, that's some serious weight, because we know that they lose their master. Now Reath sees that his master's former Padawan, who was this awesome Jedi Knight, he's now dead. Like, wow, okay, we just made the stakes real quick here, Claudia. Good job.
Yeah, it's a major loss. And actually, Anna, you bring up a good point, because to this point, there's a couple flashbacks from 25 years ago, and we do find out that Orla and Comac both lost their masters in similar situation 25 years ago, and Comac is struggling with still the acceptance of that. Like, he thought that he had to protect his master. He was the one responsible inevitably for his death, and he still hasn't gotten over it. And so the events that are happening now are kind of bringing it all back to him, and he's really struggling with the acceptance of that, which is traditionally un-Jedi-like, right? Like, you're supposed to be able to kind of let go of those attachments. But in his head, he's like, well, why should I? Like, I was supposed to, my master is the most important thing to me, and intentionally so, and I lost it, and the Jedi are expecting me to just get over it, like nothing happened. So really,
I do want to say something.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to say something critical about this, though. Like, you just outlined like why it has all this weight and the importance of it, but in terms of execution of this, like, do you remember how the master dies? In subplot C?
Andy, I don't remember anything from subplot C.
Yeah, you're gonna have to remind me too.
I forget the Master Jedi's name, but the way that they die is that they're a species that like they don't have like some like shoulder. I don't remember how they're describing it, because the thing is supposed to be wearing a seatbelt the certain way.
Oh, that's right.
They decide not to wear the seatbelt, and Comac's like, this is the one time I didn't tell my master to wear his seatbelt the right way. Like, what? That's what is that even about? Like,
that's the thing.
We couldn't think of anything a little more clever than not wearing your seatbelt appropriately. That's the lesson Claudia's giving the kids. Kids, wear your seatbelt, or else you're gonna die.
Yeah, she watched one too many crash test dummy videos growing up.
It was like, that's the thing about that, like those flashbacks and the supposedly the parallels from what's happening now and back then, which I frankly don't see to begin with, but it was just so unmemorable. Like, there's really not a whole lot that you can even draw. There's comparisons you can draw between the two circumstances, but there is supposed to be this weight, and like the reason why that exists is to give Comac and Orla some more motivation, and reason as to what's going on here. So yeah, I don't know. I don't.
Dez's situation is a little more serious. Like the dude just got
Yeah.
vaporized in our
Right.
minds, as opposed to I didn't wear my seatbelt the right way.
Yeah. And Comac is like, what's interesting is like nobody really knew Dez all that well, but they're all so distraught about his death. And fair, right? I mean, losing somebody like that is not a good thing, but you know, even Affy and Nan is described as being like totally affected by this death, and Comac is just beside himself. He's like, this young Jedi full of life, like this is not how this was supposed to happen, and we're just supposed to be okay with it. Now he's one with the Force, and everything's just supposed to be okay, and like, he can't handle it. And so that's really like the Dez death, or the presumed Dez death, is really just to give Comac a little extra push towards his character growth. So anyway, so after Dez dies, Reath goes back to investigate what happened. And while he's there, he sees Nan doing the same thing, right? Another indication that Nan is up to something that, we don't quite know yet. But there are some more clues as to who Nan really is within this sequence. She describes her story, really, like she says that her parents died a couple years ago. Haig took her on as her guardian, and she respects Haig, and she kind of gives like this she respects Haig for not being able to defend himself as like physically, but more is strong in wit, and she respects that about him, and that's why she likes him being her guardian. And Reath kind of gets the idea that okay, maybe he's some sort of like military guy. He might have some general experience or something like that. But we know eventually why he has this type of experience. And so a little more exposition about Nan there and Haig, and then when they get back, we finally get the news that Supreme Chancellor has opened up limited space travel, and that they are guaranteed to be able to go back to Coruscant through hyperspace. But before they actually do that, the Jedi decide that they got to get those idols out of there. They are convinced that the idols are emitting dark side energy, and they have to bring them back to Coruscant with them. And so all of the Jedi kind of like it's described, at least to me, like they kind of like envelop them in the light side of the Force, and they like bind them so that they can safely transport them. This is kind of an interesting part. I love heady Jedi stuff, and the way they did this was pretty interesting. But I will say that I don't quite understand what they did with the reveal of what these idols actually are. Do you know what I mean? Like, it says they like bind them with the light side of the Force, but they're actually already in the light side. Do you know what I mean?
Right. I understood it as that they broke whatever seal the idols had on the station, because they thought that the idols were emanating the dark side of the Force throughout the station.
Right.
So they broke that connection and then also enveloped them in the light side of the Force in order to safely bring them with them. Obviously, we find out that maybe they didn't need to do that, and maybe there are consequences to that, and maybe something got unleashed. But it seemed more that they broke the connection that the idols had to the station more than anything. But they probably mistakenly also thought that they bound them within the light side of the Force, because they were so focused on their thought that the idols were emanating dark side energy rather than something else possibly doing it.
Well, and I think the reveal later on too, which I don't know how much detail we're going to get into at that point, but I think they say something where like they realize the mistake now, why it was not working out the way that they thought it was. Like they met the first time they tried it didn't work. Remember, they were trying to like destroy it or something, and then they say like this is why, and it's because they were trying to like work against the literal thing that was suppressing the dark side in the first place. So it was like, I think in my mind, when you've got two sides of a magnet, a positive and negative, they're going to attract. But if you take a positive and positive, they're going to like repel. And that's basically what the Jedi were doing, was they were like working against a force that was, supposed to be helping them. And they were trying to push against that, and it was pushing back against them.
That's exactly right. And that's why like I couldn't really wrap my head around what they actually executed inevitably, with these bands. Like what did they accomplish? Like they said that they had this big, Jedi moment that, they were protected now from these idols apparently, but what did they actually do? It was kind of hard to tell listening.
I did have another thought really quickly on that. When we find out who had actually set up those idols and used them to suppress something, that might have confused them as far as what the purpose of the idols were, because it very may well could be that they were still emanating dark side energy at that point.
Yeah.
When we find out who was responsible for them later on, but also at the same time they were suppressing something else that had energy within the dark side on top of that. So maybe they were hit with two walls of dark side energy, and by canceling out one, they released another.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good thought.
Just kind of a theory.
That's a good thought
in my head as far as what they were thinking too, because the way they felt it seemed like the energy was emanating from the idols. So I wonder if the reveal of who it was that set those up leads me to believe at least that there was something else going on, maybe another layer, almost like a firewall on top of antivirus, so to speak.
You bring up a really good point with that, because in almost the next sequence, I mean, so we'll move on, but after all this, they start going back to Coruscant, right? They head back to Coruscant. They have to go on this like one last rescue mission, which I don't know is super consequential, other than seeing where like bringing back rescued Wookiees. Do you remember that part?
Yeah,
it was
it's
long.
inconsequential.
It was really a
takes
long
way
part.
too long, and I don't think we really even need to talk about it.
No, it was kind of that super weird. I don't know why that existed.
That's gonna probably pay off in another book, whether it's like the Wookiees, like that, the fact that they rescued their child, maybe they're going to do a favor for the Jedi later on in a future book. It's probably like one of those side things that we're going to get the reward later on.
Maybe they'll connect to like Buryaga or something.
Yeah.
The only thing that really is consequential is that Reath Silas's Padawan Rat Tail gets ripped off by a baby Wookiee.
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
it's just kind of funny more than anything.
Like that whole sequence is just totally useless to me. But but at any rate, the reason why I wanted to just kind of breeze past that is because after that they start to go back to Coruscant, and I want to jump off of what you had said, Ted. When they are going back to this play to Coruscant, or specifically the temple, Orla says something like, the temple was these temples are not created, they're found, right? And this specific temple was originally a Sith temple, and then the Jedi kind of took it over and it became a Jedi temple.
And they're on top of it.
Yeah, and there are specific words that they use that I should have written down that I don't know exactly, but it was interesting when they said that, because she felt something in the idols that they were coming home, and we weren't sure, are they coming home to the Jedi temple, or now that she mentions it, is it the Sith temple underneath that they're responding to? And the reveal later on, we'll just get it out of the way because I think it's important now, is that the Sith were the ones that put these idols on this station to kind of trap the Drengir and basically entrap them and keep them dormant for centuries. I mean, it seems like, and so really, really interesting point that you brought up, Ted, with the underlying Sith, power. Like there's dark side power in a couple of, or dark side, force in a couple of layers within this station, which is really interesting. I don't know if you guys want to touch on that at all.
I mean, I don't know if I can really touch on more than what you said. I guess as far as like you were trying to come up with the names, Orla mentions the shrine in the depths is where they brought them to. And that they do mention, it's been rumored that the Jedi Temple is on top of a Sith shrine. And I think, at least to my knowledge, this is the first time that in Disney canon it's actually revealed. Or am I wrong, Andy? You're shaking your head now.
Yeah, it's definitely been talked about in comics, and I think even in where do they talk about it? Maybe it's in one of the Thrawn books. It's mentioned too that like Palpatine goes to do something there.
I always
but
thought
it's
it
like
was something in Legends that was like, well, this would make sense as to how Palpatine gains power and shrouds himself from the Jedi, but that was never mentioned. But if it is, that's my mistake.
I could be wrong, but I'm feeling like I've heard this someplace before, not in Legends material, but like in canon, where Palpatine talks about going to the temple underneath, something to that effect.
It is confirmed, though, that the name the Old Republic, that is when the shrine was originally there, that they do mention the Old Republic. I made sure to put that in my notes. So like maybe that's the one that I'm mistaking it for, because I don't think we've ever had a overall confirmation of the Old Republic. People were excited about the High Republic possibly being the Old Republic. So we may get the Old Republic even further back than the High Republic after this entire saga is over with.
All right, so let's get back on track here. So the gang's going back to Coruscant, and each of the characters kind of goes through their own struggles back on Coruscant, and basically all come to the conclusion that they have to go back to the station. Reath, for example, finds out that Jorah Mali died in the battle against the Nihil, and he struggles with that. He basically like has this like his own diary. He's like, you drug us out, you dragged us out to the Outer Rim, you separated us, and you thought this was a good thing, and then you died, like, and kind of just monologuing a little bit, just on his and letting his anger out, about Jorah Mali's death. But inevitably, so he's called by the council, and a couple things that go on here. He's asked kind of what he wants to do next as a Padawan, which is kind of monumental for a Padawan. They kind of leave the decision is in his hands. When to continue his training, who to continue his training with, and kind of what to do in his training.
This is a great juxtaposition with the future Jedi of like the Republic era, where you've got now Mace Windu, Yoda saying, no, we cannot train him, he's too old. Like, no, like Obi-Wan, you don't like it's very much like no. Whereas this council's like, yeah, what do you need, Silas? Like more time off? Like what do you want to do? Like this is like your decision to be made, not ours as the council.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we're used to seeing the Jedi Council as insanely rigid, and to give a Padawan that kind of freedom and discretion is very different from what we've seen already from the Jedi. And again, I've mentioned it a billion times already, but it just furthers Claudia Gray did this, I think, the best in this book, is really furthers the distance between the Jedi we see in the High Republic and the Jedi that we see in the New Republic era.
What is that called? Like, we need to refer to them as like
know.
the appropriate things, but they've
I think
changed
it's just the
them.
Republic, isn't it?
I think it's called Republic Era.
Yeah, it's just the Republic era. It's just
So
weird.
I think that's what they do in those comics. That there's like a one-off comic series that's like each different era.
Yeah.
And a couple stories from each different era from the characters of those eras. And I think they refer to it as the Republic era for that series.
Yep. So where were we? So the council asks him about what he wants to do, and then he also kind of asks, he's also asked kind of what happened, on the station, and he was surprised that they asked him to kind of recount his experience, but by doing so, he realizes that Nana's a nihil, and he mistook her inquisitive mind as flirting with him. Like, she was asking all sorts of questions about the Jedi and about him, and he's like, oh well, I'm the noble Jedi that's supposed to spread the word about the Republic and what we can do for the Outer Rim. And so he totally obliges her, and now he realizes that he just gave away a ton of information about the Jedi to the Nihil, who can use it against them to further their goals in the galaxy. So that's his motivation for going back. He knows that they stayed behind on the space station, and so he wants to go back and confront them because he thinks that they're going to abuse the station for their
capture
own goals.
them, turn them in, because he feels like a sense of justice needs to be served.
Oh, not only that, the Nihil killed his master, so there's a not necessarily a revenge factor, but just a, hey, your people wronged me, and I need to do something about this. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, there's definitely an aspect of that in there, which is another thing that the Jedi aren't supposed to do, but I digress. Then Affy actually does confront Skovar about the station. And Skovar is like totally flippant about it. But she finds out that after all this conversation, she finds out that the guild indentures pilots to run missions for them. They basically have slaves in the Bind Guild that they use to fulfill their goals. She realizes that her parents were part of that as well. And so that furthers her motivation. And she now wants to go back to the ship to get proof to present to Skovar that the ship the station, I should say, is dangerous. They have to stop using it. And she thinks that if she can go and get this proof, that she can present it to Skovar and they'll stop. And so that's her motivation to go back. And then Orla and Comac, they realized that they were wrong about the idols, that the idols were not the ones that were emitting dark side, though they may have been to Ted's point, but they weren't the problem. They were actually keeping the dark side force that they felt at bay. They still don't know what that was yet, but they know that they made a mistake. And kind of through all of this, they all recognize the mistakes that they made, which I thought was really interesting. Like, Reath realizes that he made a mistake by trusting Nan. Affy realizes that she's kind of currently making a mistake by kind of going along with Skovar and trusting her blindly. And Orla and Comac realized that their mistake was they were not correct about their feeling of the Force. They were kind of betrayed by their feeling of the Force, even though they were extremely confident in what they were doing. And so they know that they have to. Orla and Comac now realize they have to bring it back to fix what they had done, and here we go. So we're going back to the space station. After this it's almost like a post-war sort of feeling. Like, they're all back on the station. They're like they can't readjust to Coruscant life, and they're like, I belong on this station, you know? So they all go back to the station. And the Jedi, one thing that's kind of interesting is that the 3 Jedi left, they kind of have to like skirt around the council. Like they kind of make these excuses to go to the station. You know, the council didn't explicitly say they couldn't, but they didn't explicitly say they could. And they're kind of using that gray area to. As
they're all like relying on loopholes in order to justify, like, oh, well, they didn't say, so I guess we can go. And like, well, I'm a wayfinder, so this is like where my path leads me.
Yeah.
Like all the sorts of excuses that they can make to do this thing they know they shouldn't be doing.
Right.
Yeah, it's like there are 3 Qui-Gons in this moment.
Yes.
Yeah. They're all like they're now all struggling with whether they should be totally loyal to the council and do exactly what they say, or maybe there's some gray area. And they find it. So the gang's back together, along with Leox and Geode and Affy. They all find their way back to the vessel and they take off. So we go back to this.
They do steal
station.
the idols, by the way. From
Oh,
the
good.
temple.
Yeah. That's a good call. They have to steal it from the temple.
Comac and Reath make a plan to do so, and they find out that Orla already just took them.
Yeah. She's like, we're just going to take them for research.
Yeah, pretty much. She just said she was taking them somewhere, and people believed her.
Yeah, they just
let
let
her
her
do
do
it.
it. They just let her do it. So, the vessel goes back, and they drop out of hyperspace, and lo and behold, an entire Nihil storm is now orbiting the space station. And so they have to like figure out how they're going to get into the space station without being detected by the Nihil. And Leox is dope, and he like figures out a way to get themselves into orbit without being detected. Of course, it's like, well, they'll sense our engine signature if we boost up. So we're just gonna let some extra fuel out and we'll get into orbit. So they do. So they get into orbit at the same speed and rate as the Nihil, so that they won't actually see them. So the rest of the crew sneak onto the station. Reath goes back to see what happened with Dez, and this is probably my favorite part of the book. Is when Reath kind of finds out what actually happened to Dez and the events following. And that is that he realizes that Dez was sent on a one-way hyperspace pod to the Drengir, excuse me. Did they, I didn't write this down, did they mention where it was that he was sent by chance?
No, and it's left ambiguous as to whether it's an Amaxine planet or if it's a Drengir planet. Really all that's mentioned is that the Drengir say that the Amaxine were using the station in order to conquer other worlds and other peoples very easily by just putting the coordinates in and shooting their pods out to wherever they go and catching people by surprise. And it's really just kind of left up to our imagination as to whether the Drengir lived there or the Amaxine lived there or neither, and if the Drengir came there from the station from another place. So it's really ambiguous, but at least from what we know, the Drengir are now inhabiting this world that he's sent to.
Right. It's a good point, because they actually mention, like, when Reath mentions the Amaxines, they're like, the Amaxines, we destroyed the Amaxines, like, you know, and which if you know about the Amaxines is a pretty major feat, which kind of puts it into perspective what these Drengir are capable of. So let's talk about the Drengir a little bit, because we haven't really mentioned what they are, but essentially they're sentient plant beings, and they are, it's hard to describe kind of where their place in the Force is. They're certainly dark beings, but are they, towards the Sith end of the spectrum. It's kind of hard to say. What do you guys think about the Drengir? I think they're super cool characters, but I want to hear from you guys.
Well, I think they're definitely dark side. Like, there's no question, like, which side of, like, the light side versus the dark side.
Surely.
Remember, like, Sith and Jedi are just religions. So the Sith religion, believes in that the dark side of the Force is the true essence, or the way that you should be using the Force. So I don't think, like, the Drengir are going to fall into that religious narrative. They are just creatures of the dark side. Where I think they'll serve a purpose in the story is to essentially provide what the Yuuzhan Vong were in the expanded universe, so which is now Legends material. And these were creatures from outside the galaxy. In this case, they're creatures from inside the galaxy, but from a different time, a different era, who are now being re-released into the galaxy, essentially. But the Yuuzhan Vong are known for their ability to, like, be immune to the Force. The Force doesn't work on them. They have weapons that are like anti-lightsaber weapons. So that's what we kind of get with the Drengir. You can chop them up, but it doesn't matter. They're just going to regenerate, grow right back. It appears, at least they're not resistant to the Force, but they're emanating the dark side of the Force. So this idea of, like, light versus dark, no matter how much, light force you throw at them, they're going to throw back the dark force at you to, like, resistance. So, like, there's going to be some kind of dynamic probably later on when we get more, interaction with Jedi and Drengir. And then also, they seem to use, like, poison and ways to, like, manipulate other creatures using these poisons or intoxicants or whatever. And so we'll probably see some of that later on too, where what happens with Des, we'll get there in a little moment, of being essentially brainwashed. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some kind of battle ensue between Jedi who are also brainwashed, thinking that they need to kill other Jedi.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it doesn't seem like they're Force users from what I've gathered. At least maybe they don't know that they can use the Force, or if they can, but they definitely emanate dark side energy. They are part of the dark side, and they fall into a weird category of plant and sentient at the same time. Like, they mentioned how jarring Reath thought it was when he saw this plant holding a blaster, which was really interesting. And when you look up the concept art, and I would say that people should look up concept art from these books for characters and creatures and everything, just to get an idea of what these things look like. They look like a giant plant monster. They kind of remind me of Rick and Morty has these kind of floating ball sack monsters that control time. And they kind of remind me of those. I know you guys can tell what I'm talking about here. Like, that they're kind of like eyeless, but they're big mouths and everything like that. And that's what they reminded me of when I looked them up. But they've got vines shooting off of them, leaves, all this stuff. But they can hold a blaster too, which is really interesting. That they're a creature, but also they're a people.
Yeah. A really intriguing group the Drengir are. It's I'm really interested to see where the Drengir will show up next and what implication they'll have in the future. But for now, what happens is, Andy, I think you mentioned it. They rely on poison to kind of brainwash their victims. And that's exactly what they did to Des. Des was sent to this place, and he's been kind of under their control ever since. And they poison him to, ideally, they want information from him. And there's very little information that they actually get from him. And so when Reath comes into the picture, which they refer to as new meat, which was a little uncomfortable for me as well as Reath. They're like, oh, he's even younger. He talks more, but he has even less information than the last one. And so they actually pit Des against Reath and say, well, let's see how you do with a lightsaber. If you kill him, we'll set you free. You can go. And again, Reath is under this, this poison control, and he blindly goes after him. And they start fighting, and this is actually the same. This is basically the vision that Reath had earlier in the book, is this Jedi coming after him. And in the earlier vision, it's mentioned that, Reath basically, he basically says that like a Jedi would never attack another Jedi knowingly. And he was able to kind of like in his vision, he was able to bring the situation down, and he did a similar thing here in the actual scenario. He was able to kind of get to Dez before he had a chance to really, have it out with him. Though they did end up like battling a little bit. It was a really cool sequence.
Yeah, I enjoyed it because it's another example of interesting ways that these characters in the High Republic era use the Force. So from what I gathered of the description of it, Reath essentially like Force pushed thoughts to Dez through the Force, connecting with him over their shared master, Joramali, basically telling Dez that she's dead. I just found out that she's dead. And like using that moment of weakness that he gets out of Dez, like it's only a moment. It's only like a flicker of Dez snapping out of the control, where he's able to subdue him at that point. And then he's trying to help Dez escape off this planet from the Drengir and get back to the station.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a really, really interesting sequence. And so he was able to bring him back to the ship. To be honest, I don't remember exactly how they escaped. I think he went back to the Amaxine control panel. But
it has a launching station there too, so they could go back and forth.
Yeah, so they go back to the pods that were launched to the planet and escape in one of them, and then the Drengir say, well, go ahead, leave. We're going to follow you.
Right.
We're going to be right behind you.
Right.
Which, the solution probably would have been, now that I think of it, is like, I guess, set up both pods to go if Reath could, but I'm sure in the heat of the moment, especially with Dez passed out, you can't really do that.
Well, I think it had to be launched from within as well, and Dez probably couldn't do that.
Yeah, probably not.
Now that I'm remembering, but also this was also confirmation for the Drengir that their station, the everything was still there. Like they were still. They may have been dormant, but they were still there on the space station.
Yeah, and that's the information that they want to know. Some of it. They do still want to know what happened to some of their comrades who might be on the station, which we'll find out pretty soon here.
Well, and there's some disagreement too among the Drengir. Like, why should we worry about these? If they lost essentially the battle, why should we even bother? Like, what's the point of this?
Yeah, but why would we risk ourselves for those losers, essentially? Mm-hmm. But they do come to the conclusion that, well, whether or not we go there for them, we need to go there because we know this station is still operational and we can use it.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah, and that was the same motivation that the Nihil have, is that they want to use this station basically to quickly get wherever they need to go because of the helix rings in there. They can send information, they can send warriors, they can send whatever they need to anywhere in the galaxy, or at least anywhere in the region, essentially within moments.
Which is really scary, thinking about what we learn about them in Light of the Jedi, as far as like their ability to show up anywhere through the hyperspace lanes with the paths that they have. Adding another layer to that would make them pretty much unstoppable.
Right. Yeah. And so if this station were to fall under control of the Nihil, the galaxy would be in big trouble. So that was kind of what, the Nihil were doing there. So back on the station, Orla and Comac, basically they discover that the station is just overrun with these Drengir now. and they understand that what they did set the Drengir free. And so now they have to figure out what they're going to do to contain them again. Beyond, well, again, this is something I don't really remember. What actually happened to contain them? What events did they take to put them back into a dormant state, at least for the time being?
I believe they did the.
They just
I'm
like
trying to remember.
reverse
I mean, they
force
bring
thing?
the idols back, and I think they released the seal that they have on them.
They just
essentially
reverse
what happens.
their force.
Yeah, and I
thing.
think that ends
Yeah.
up being easier because they're releasing the seal that they put on it rather than trying to block something that they did originally. Because I think
Okay.
it's only Orla and Comac who end up doing that part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was just the two of them because Reath was preoccupied with Dez. Dez couldn't do anything,
Right.
Because he was still kind of under the poison.
Yeah, so the Drengir are now in stasis again after they do that, but they have the Nihil to deal with now.
Right.
So
And-
the classic from Lord of the Rings, out of the frying pan into the fire. You know, you go from one problem right into the next one.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Affy does some pretty badass maneuvers. She is obsessed with this thermal detonator, and like it's the most important thing to her at this point in time. And she finally gets to use it. She like throws a detonator and distracts the Nihil, so that so that the Jedi can escape to back out to the vessel.
I
The vessel
think
has
it's
to come
literally
rescue them. The vessel has to come in and rescue them.
Yeah, at this point, I think one of the bigger ships from the Nihil storm docked at the station.
Right.
So
yes. Yeah.
And in order to kind of, I guess, fight back against them, but preemptively, she throws the thermal detonator at the airlock and tries to kill as many of them as possible. And it does kill a few of them, that's for sure. But they just come out angry more than anything that
Right.
somebody did that to them.
Yeah. Well, and then so they have to get out of this ship now. So they have Dez. Everything is just a mess on this station, and so they meet up with Reath again. Orla, Comac, and Reath kind of all meet up, and Orla and Comac are like, "You're not gonna like this, but we've got to release the Drengir." And so they have to release the Drengir in order to distract the Nihil, for their crew to escape. They do, but Reath kind of like goes back to make sure that the station is unusable in the future, right? He like does something with the airlock there too.
Yeah, so this might be a little later, but he does end up going to the control panel for the pods, the remaining pods, and he just enters in random coordinates and jettisons them into space.
Yeah, they're all
He's
gone.
just like, these need to go away. Hopefully they don't land anywhere where somebody can actually use these. Hopefully they just end up at the end of a hyperspace lane in the middle of nowhere. So that's his hope, and I'm sure it probably sets up for future stories where maybe one doesn't go to the middle of nowhere, but at least he's trying everything he can. But at the same time here, we've got the Nihil attacking, so Comac and Orla, or actually Orla and Reath, make the decision to release the Drengir again. So the Drengir attack the Nihil is the plan, at least.
Right.
That some are skeptical of that. I think it's Affy who's like, well, how do we know they're going to attack them? And it's just like, we got to try something because we're not getting out of here unless we do something, because the Nihil are going to kill us. So what they end up doing is first they try to reseal the idol, or not reseal, but take the seal off of the idols again. But they fail. So what ends up happening is Orla is just like, screw it. takes a blaster, blasts one of the idols, and that destroys the connection between the idols and the barrier that they have around the Drengir, and the Drengir are set free. And the Drengir immediately want to attack the Jedi, of course, because they're the ones who sealed them. But I think the Nihil end up like throwing a smoke grenade or something, and Orla either deflects it or dodges it, and it hits the Drengir, and they're pissed off, and they go to attack the Nihil at this point. But they're also trying to keep the Jedi and their crew there by wrapping their vines around the vessel while it's docked. So while they're distracted with the Nihil, they're still using their abilities to keep them there. So it's like, once we're done with these assholes, we're going to deal with you right after.
Yeah. Well, and then very cleverly, they get the Nihil to, or not the Nihil, the Drengir to harm the plant life on the space station, and here come the 8T droids, and they prune the hell out of these Drengir, and it allows the crew to escape in the vessel.
Yeah, they still do have to deal with the vines, though. So the last thing that Reath does, and this is like the one thing that might cost him his life before they leave, is he goes back again, and he finds another control panel for the airlock in the Arboretum, which is like the main area where all the plants are.
Oh, yeah.
And he opens up the airlock, and that he does exhale first, because obviously he doesn't want his lungs to expand and for him to die when everything is surrounding him is the vacuum of space, essentially. And he just jettisons all these Nihil and Drengir out of there. I do want to bring up, too, we skipped it. Another cool way that Reath kills Drengir again is he kills the Drengir that follow him and Dez from that planet back to the station. And the way he does this is right before they get out of their pod, he force pushes the pod back into the tunnel where the helix rings are. And the Drengir are upset about this. So they're just like, screw it. We're getting out of the pod and just climbing our way through the tunnel and eating them. And when they get out of there, Reath activates the helix rings, which just incinerate them. But one of the things I really appreciate about this book is, even though these Jedi are like faced with incredibly terrible odds against them and these powerful creatures and enemies that could easily destroy them, they don't necessarily use the Force and like do these super badass Force maneuvers to destroy their enemies. They use their heads, and like they use their heads and the Force in tandem to find creative ways to get rid of these enemies. And I really appreciated how that was written in this story.
Well, in that part in particular is a great callback to, like, that's how they thought Dez died. And Reath recognized that, and he's like, oh, wait, this will work. And he incinerates them with the helix rings that were supposed to have killed Dez. So a really cool callback there. Overall, I mean, this last act, there were some really cool moments in it. As you may have noticed, I had a hard time really like paying attention to everything that happened because it was pretty jumpy.
There's a lot that happens, and it jumps back and forth a lot.
Yeah. This was not my favorite part of the book in terms of the writing. It was just really jarring and difficult to keep up with, in my opinion. But again, there were some really there were some of the biggest highlights of the book in this part as well. Toward the end of their stay on their second stay on the station, they start to get out of town there, and then Leox comes in with some hero mode stuff and heals Dez with his medicinal spice, which I think is the spice thing is weird in Star Wars.
It is. I'm trying to figure out what spice is. We talked about this before we got on here. It's like we have stories where it's like an opium fiend who's addicted to it and is just a total mess. But then you've got people like Leox who seem to just like it seems like it's their version of pot in the Star Wars universe, and it can be used medicinally. So like my question to you guys earlier was like, what is spice? Is it a catch-all phrase just that means drugs? Or is it something that like there are so many strains of this thing that it could be highly addictive, it could not be, it could be medicinal, it could be recreational. Like I don't know what it is, and I want to know.
You said it right there. So it's like spice is a word that refers to all types of different things, like drugs essentially, but it's different types of spice. So they don't like discern necessarily one type of spice from another, like as they refer to it, but there are different types of spice depending on like what you want to do. I think that's Disney's way of being able to reference drugs without saying the word drugs. So like they'll talk about some spice that like is basically like Coke, and then some spices basically like cannabis. They won't actually say that explicitly, but they'll tell you like the different experience or whatever, who's ever using it, what type of spice they're running, what it's being used for, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's just so much. There's been so much about spice, like, you know, spice mines in Kessel. Like, there's very likely one kind of spice on Kessel, right? Are there other types of spice elsewhere in the galaxy? You know, like I don't know. I just think it's like a kind of just like you said, like just a catch-all, just to be able to reference drugs, you know. And there's nothing really specific about it. I don't even know that there would be different strains or different types of spice out there. It's just a generic word for drugs, and they'll use it however, you know, they need to use it to fit whatever narrative they're using it for.
Yeah,
That's
which makes sense when we talk about it and break it down. But like before that, there are mentions of like the word drugs in Star Wars. I'm pretty sure in some of these stories. So like what confused me, I guess, is like, what's the difference between drugs as an overall term and spice as an overall term? But it probably makes sense that they're just using it as a catch-all. Andy looks like he's looking something up here.
No, I did. Yeah, I went to the Wikipedia for the canon, and so spice, also known as narco spice, was a slang for various mind-altering drugs. Varieties include Ryle, the strongest, most expensive, glitter stim. The planet Kessel was rich with these spices, which are harvested in dangerous mines at one point in history, blah, blah, slave labor. So, yeah, there are different
all that
types.
come from? I've never heard that before. Where's that referenced? Glitter stim?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Well,
Star
we can pick that up
Wars.
another time. But I'm just
Yeah,
like,
glitter stim sounds like the bath salts of spice.
It looks like a lot of the references are from episodes of the Clone Wars for the canon here. And then I'm looking for any other. It's a bunch of the Star Wars comics mention different types of spice at various points in times.
I guess that's kind of a more appropriate medium for that sort of content. Yeah, that makes sense.
We're not getting this referenced in Rogue One, where
right.
Jyn Erso talks about how her mom actually had a spice problem, and she had to go to rehab before they left to go hide away.
Yeah. Well, that's another example of like a throwaway line leading into something more, like the spice mines at Kessel. Like, what are those? You don't know any context for that when C-3PO says that, but now it's its whole thing. I did want to bring up one thing that I did miss when we're talking about Reath and the airlock and the Arboretum. He is saved by none other than Geode. So that is the big payoff.
Yeah.
Is that Geode, the entire book, is referenced as this thing that might not be sentient, might be sentient. Reath cannot gather any force energy from him, cannot get any signature from him. And finally, when he saves Reath, he feels him through the force. And it's just a really cool moment. And it doesn't show how he gets there. We still have a lot to question about what Geode is, who he is, and how he moves around and everything. I expected him to sprout arms and legs at one point and just kind of like hide them like a turtle, but we don't even get that. So like all we know is he's sentient and he's awesome and he saves the day.
I pictured that scene where like Reath like looks up and it's just this boulder with like sunlight right behind it, and all you see is like this shimmering geode. I can't believe we forgot about that moment. It was so funny. I just love geode. I love geode.
And if you look up the concept art for geode too, it's just a rock.
It's a rock.
There's nothing else. I was looking for like, there's got to be something in the concept art that like leads you to believe it might be sentient. Yeah, like anything. It's just a slab of stone. It's not even a boulder. It's like a very straight slab for some reason.
Yeah. Well, that's like, I didn't look at any of the art before I read the book, and I was like, I had this vision in my mind. I was like, that's the geode savior pose.
Yeah.
But remember, I mean, he was on Coruscant. Geode was like living it up in the clubs.
Yeah,
and
he's into the nightlife on Coruscant.
Yeah,
for sure.
He's smoked 1 or 2 death sticks in his life too. I'm pretty sure.
Rex is like, that guy's got to slow down. I just love the references to Geode. It's so funny. All right, anyway,
the irony on this part is not lost to me, though. How in other iterations of Star Wars, the Jedi has to like lift the rock as a moment of training, and in this moment, it's Reath smashing into the rock is his like his not training necessarily, but like this is the ironic part where it's like, oh, he's not saved because he can lift rocks. He's saved because he crashes into one.
That is
so a rock saves.
Yeah, that's funny. That's a good call out. So, all right, guys, let's get into the resolutions of this book and kind of wrap it up a little bit because we're pretty much at the end here. So back on Coruscant again, a few things happen to kind of wrap it up here. So Affy actually gets offered to kind of lead the guild by Skovar, and this is after Affy finds all this stuff out about Skovar and the Bind Guild and what actually goes on there, including and not limited to the the indentured servitude that goes on, and Leox is running Spice, right? I mean, and there's like, not that that's the main issue here, but I mean, there's a lot of things that Affy just can't agree with, that Skovar has set up as kind of the main mechanics of the Bind Guild, and Affy inevitably turns down the Skovar's offer. Not only that, but she turns her into the authorities, and Skovar is arrested. And I just think this is a really kind of interesting way to go down, because in Star Wars you always think like, oh, she's going to go by coercion of blaster, or it's like, it's never just a judicial cut and dry, she gets arrested, she goes to prison. You know what I mean? Like there's usually something else to go with, but it's just she just turned her in, and that was it.
Yeah,
that was the end of it.
I think it subverted expectations a little bit, because obviously Affy goes to the station to gather more information and confront Skovar with this information, and basically, like, maybe not with the plan of holding her at blaster point, but maybe she will at some point, and like she's hoping that this information will just dissuade Skovar from using these practices of putting these indentured servants in super dangerous positions. And when Skovar essentially offers the guild to her, like control of it now, but definite control and like passing on of the guild to her in the future when Skovar retires. And Affy like legitimately thinks about it at this point. And she's like, maybe I can just buy my time, pay my dues, and then eventually I'll be able to run things the way I want to and make the change I want to. But I like that, even though like maybe the way she did it is kind of jarring as far as Star Wars, I do like that like she goes immediately from that thought to, no, screw that. Even though she raised me and she was good to me and all this stuff, my parents are dead because of her, and other people are going to die because of her, and I can't just sit idly by and watch this happen. I need to do something about it. And she does, and she ends up getting the guild by proxy anyway, because she's the next in command, and the vessel belongs to her. The entire guild now belongs to her. The Republic essentially hands everything over to her, no questions asked.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, which is cool. Hopefully we see more of Affy and the Buying Guild in the future. You know, I
think we will.
I love this crew, and I hope we see him again.
I definitely think we're going to see the crew, though, but I think what this actually sets up is a chain of events for the crime lords to take over. So this is something that's mentioned in the subplot C, but it ties directly to this. I think it's like that parallel is the fact that what ends up happening in subplot C with these like two ruling parties or whatever is it was really like the Hutts that were behind it all, right? So like they're the masterminds, if you will, behind the scenes here, concocting the scheme or whatever to take advantage of these two planets. How does that relate to what's going on with Affy? Well, indentured servitude is essentially slavery light. You know, you get paid to do it. It's not as bad maybe as slavery because eventually you can get out of it. But at least it's like some kind of like systematic structure in place that prevents slavery. Well, the consequence now of what happened with Affy, there is no longer that. So who's going to take, that space up? Who's going to occupy that void now that there isn't essentially legal slavery in the form of indentured servitude? The Hutts are going to take over with slavery. So I think that's what we're going to build up to is like, this is going to create more conflict than necessary resolution for Affy and ultimately lead to what we see in the prequel era, which is, the Hutts ruling Tatooine and crime syndicates, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a great point. That would be super interesting to see. I mean, the Hutts, I think, are extremely underrated, but I mean, we see them as a crime, syndicate family, even past, the events of the New Republic, in the Aftermath series, the Hutts are still prevalent. I mean, the Hutts don't go anywhere. I mean, they've been in and around crime for forever. And this would be, I like that point. This would be a really cool way to introduce some Hutt material.
Mm-hmm.
I like it.
I don't know if we'll necessarily see Hutts more often. I wouldn't be surprised if we did, but at least knowing like what Affy did, she thinks she did the right thing. And she might have, but her actions are going to cause way more harm to people now that essentially the black market is going to exist. Oh, we need people to do these things. Okay, it's going to be slave labor. Mm-hmm. We're going to rely on marauders to do things or whatever. That's no longer a legal entity.
Yeah, adding more moral conflict to the galaxy. Yep. Yeah, cool. So that's Affy's story, and that kind of wraps that up. And then, so the Jedi are a different story. The Jedi appear in front of the council. They're not super happy with them. They do say, this is, you went went behind our backs to do this, but there was good reason to do so. And they always this council kind of always gives an out to the Jedi. Even when when Reath was saying what he did in terms of what he told Nan, they're like, well, you didn't know at the time. We would have done the same thing. Same thing with Comac and Orla. Well, you didn't know at the time. This is the information that you had. They're kind of always giving them an out of punishment. And this is another example of that. And I know we beat to death, the differences between this Jedi Order and the one we're used to, but it's evident in this book in particular.
And it's important. I think it's something that should be beat to death, because I think that's a big point of this era, is to show the fall of the Jedi into the arrogant, very strict order that it becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the beginning of the end.
Because we have to see that, why do the Jedi decide to go to a much more conservative, a much more traditional sense of the Jedi? There was an error of their ways. And so instead of choosing like, oh, we need to reform our beliefs, it was, no, we need to double down on our beliefs. The Jedi Code needs to be strict, not allow people to meander through the gray lines of like, what should we be doing? What should we be doing? No, this is the way. This is the Jedi Order. This is the things we do. We need to follow them to a T. Otherwise, bad things like what's going to transpire over the entire High Republic era, the events that lead up to the fall of the Jedi ultimately, are going to be just that. We'll learn what those things were.
Yep, absolutely. So a couple of key moments for these Jedi. Orla ends up buying a ship for her Wayseeker journey, which is kind of like, there wasn't a lot of mention of Orla through this whole thing, but her whole thing was like, she was like excited to go to the Outer Rim, and she wanted to talk to Leox about her ships and like how to buy ships, and it kind of all came down to this, where she buys her own ship from a sales droid, and names it the Lightseeker. And so she's going to hopefully take off on her own journey. And maybe we'll see her in the future.
Jedi Way Seekers, or is that what they're called?
That's kind of what she refers to herself as. Yeah.
They kind of remind me of that whole thing with, I think it's the Amish, that like Rumspringa, where, teenagers are allowed to essentially go to the modern world and live a couple months in that, and like figure out what they want to do with their lives before they either commit to, hey, I'm going to live like a regular American person, or I'm going to commit to this Amish lifestyle. That's kind of what that feels like to me for her. Like the Jedi are allowing her to kind of expand on her path and her horizons in order to find what her path is going to be.
Yeah, that's
what you're saying.
Good comparison.
Well, I was going to make a joke and just say, so what you're saying is we need to let Anakin loose a little bit back in the Clone Wars, let him get his thing on, let him maybe do a little spice.
Maybe
kind of did anyway, right?
But that's just it. He did those things like, well, I don't know if he did spice or whatnot, but like he was working against it because, he felt like it was wrong. And
that's the thing. Does he have this jilted attitude toward the Council and the Jedi Order on the whole, if he's allowed to do these things sparingly, within reason? Or does he just go off the rails anyway? Maybe he does, because he still wants to use the dark side to save his wife, but I don't know. Who can say?
Well, that's a different conversation.
Yeah.
But the other side of the coin is Reath has to kind of decide what his Padawan path is going to be. The very opposite of Anakin's journey. He kind of gets to go on his own path and just and carve out what he wants to do as a Padawan, where he wants to train, who he wants to train with, and he asks Comac to take him on as a Padawan, which would be definitely out of Reath's comfort zone, very different than Jorah Mali, and definitely out of Comac's comfort zone. And as Comac has never had a Padawan before. And he discloses to Reath that, after all of this has happened, he has a wavering view of the Jedi and their practices, and, being able to express emotion and feel emotion and go through things that normal beings go through, while still being able to be a Jedi. And he inevitably says to Reath, we'll learn together. I will take you on as a Padawan, and we'll learn together. So that was I think a really interesting moment for this, for the end of the Reath Silas journey that we see at this point, and kind of a new beginning for him as well.
I like it that it's kind of what Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon's relationship was like a little bit.
Yeah.
I didn't read Master and Apprentice, so I don't know, but like that's kind of like the sense that I'm getting from these two individuals, like what the Claudia Gray is setting up to do, is that we're gonna get like the master and apprentice, and kind of like more into those kind of dynamics between two individuals. Reath, who is all about the Jedi, what they should be doing. It's a different era, so of course, like the rules are a little bit looser and there's more flexibility with things. But Reath is definitely like the expert on like what the Jedi should be doing and what their history are. And although Comac is also an expert of history, his kind of take now and thing is like, nah, I'm kind of thinking like, I want to look into the dark side of the Force and see what that's all about.
That's a good comparison. I don't think it'll be apples for apples the same, because I think Obi-Wan is more rigid in the sense that like he respects Qui-Gon, but he's not really even sure why he's stuck with Qui-Gon as a master, and like questions a lot of that, especially in the book Master and Apprentice. Whereas Reath seems like excited about the opportunity to learn from somebody who like just admitted to him that he has wavering trust in the direction of the Jedi and what they're going to do, but they also like come to the same conclusion that we're going to learn from each other, and that's going to be interesting to see. And it will be interesting to see too. I could see a Comac falling to the dark side, or falling to some semblance of it, or maybe dabbling in it, which will be really interesting to see if any of that also leads to the rigidity and strictness of the Jedi going forward as well. Maybe something with them happens specifically as the focus of these stories going forward.
I could definitely see that. With Comac's his attitude toward the Jedi now, I mean, you can see you could feel the tension that he has with the Jedi and the traditional Jedi ways. And, I'm glad you brought up Master and Apprentice. If you haven't read it, you really should. It's another Claudia Gray book. And that's another book that does a great job at kind of blurring the lines between the light and the dark, and the relationship between the two. And that's where Comac is at right now. It's like, should this line be a hard line? Because I don't think so, right? That's what Comac is kind of feeling at this point. It's like, I don't know that we should be drawing these hard lines between the light and the dark, because they are so connected. And, he sees that from, the events that happen on the Amaxian station. So wrapping up this book, and there's a couple other things that happen at the end, but I think that this book did a great job at setting up future events. I think we'll see, I hope we'll see all of these characters again. And I'm excited to see kind of where the story goes, but I think this was a great stepping stone in the right direction of the High Republic. So I guess before we get into our final thoughts, let's wrap up. They all end up on Starlight Beacon, which kind of coincides right with Light of the Jedi. They go there for the opening celebration, and the Queen does reference the events that happened 25 years ago to Orla and Comac and their masters. This actually, if you're keeping up with the comics as well, everything kind of seems to, at least so far, everything kind of seems to coalesce right at this Starlight Beacon celebration. The end of every story ends here.
I think that's going to be the pattern for all of because there are 3 phases to the High Republic. Yeah. This is phase 1. I think all of them are supposed to end with Starlight Beacon ceremony.
It's really interesting to me. I mean, I want to see the next chapter and what happens, but it's cool that we get to see all of these stories working together that end in the same place. And then what do they have to offer for the future of the High Republic? What are we going to draw from these stories and all the events that happened for the next chapter? So that'll be pretty cool.
So you're saying it's nice when Star Wars stories have a direction and a plan.
All right. Let's not get into that right now. This is a book club.
All right. This isn't the place. Sorry. Fine.
This is a book club. And we're positive here. We're all positive, all positivity. Star Wars.
You're right. You're right.
Star Wars is the best.
One last thing I want to touch on plot-wise really quickly is the direction that Des ends up going after his experience is
we didn't talk about Des.
He takes this thing called the Bearish Vow, which is supposedly this commitment to regaining his connection to the Force, and it involves years of meditation and solitude. He says that what he went through with the Drengir and the poisoning and the manipulation of his mind somewhat broke his connection to the Force, and especially because they're so steeped in the dark side. So he really wants to reconnect. I wonder if he might be another candidate for things with the dark side going forward as far as the Jedi are concerned. And
Yep.
I'd be interested to see what direction this Bearish Vow takes and like what things he actually does. I don't know if they will explore that stuff, but it seems like they're setting stuff up further. And this like goes even further into like a very strict Jedi type. Seems like very much more monk-like. Like they make jokes in this book about the Jedi being monks who fight, but I would say like this specifically is way more monk-like than anything. Like the meditation and solitude and like really committing yourself to connecting to the Force. So I thought it was interesting that they put that in there for Des.
Absolutely. Yeah, I forgot about Des. Yeah, he really interesting resolution. Well, it's not really a resolution for him. I think it's going to be interesting to see where he goes. And then wrapping up this story is Nan, who speaks with our favorite Nihil, Marchion Ro. And basically he tells him, he tells her the Jedi are a formidable foe, but we're going to take them down, and that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not much else more than that with Marchion. We didn't get a whole lot of them in this story. But boy, do I just get eager to see where he goes for sure.
Absolutely.
So, well, very cool, guys. That's Into the Dark. Let's talk about kind of our final thoughts here. Before we wrap up, what are some of the weak points or strong points that you guys want to point out in this book? I mean, we've already mentioned a lot of it, but any highlights in particular you want to shout out?
I guess I'll go. Looks like Andy's thinking. So a weak point to me, and we touched upon this, and I'll touch upon it a little bit more here, is that little C plot, essentially, where they go back 25 years. And I guess like the important thing from that is it furthers Comac's thoughts about whether the Jedi are right about not having connections to people that they're stuck with all the time with their masters because he loses his master. And then Orla learns to trust her instincts, because when she doesn't trust her instincts in this sequence, and I won't even go into it because it really doesn't even matter, but somebody ends up dead. And she has a great deal of remorse for that. And her instincts were telling her one thing, but the Jedi protocol was telling her something else. And she followed the protocol. And instead now, leading into what she's going off to do now, she trusts herself and the Force more than she does the protocol, and that's why she's kind of going in a different direction right now. But it was weakly told. I thought it distracted from the overall story, and I think there were other ways that they could have gone about just connecting those things, because they kept talking about, like we said, oh, this feels a lot like this thing that happened 25 years ago, and you're like, but how?
How though? Yeah.
Yeah, and without going into too much detail, they really don't relate very much. I thought there would be more congruencies, and there weren't. So I don't know. It just really fell flat for me. I thought the strength of this book was the character moments and the real getting into who the characters were and connecting with them. And I guess just the feel of the book, I would say it was kind of like a video game to me. It kind of felt a little bit like Fallen Order as far as like the order and sequence of things, where You start off in one place with a mission. You get sidetracked, end up at this station. You go back to Coruscant where things began, and you have a choice to make. And that choice for all of these characters leads them back to this station, very much like in Fallen Order, where you end up back to these different planets that you started off in, and you have to find things out about yourself, about the Jedi, and about just what's going on in these different places that you've already been. And then the resolution is back to this thing that you were skeptical about going to, which was Starlight Beacon.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think that's pretty much all my thoughts on it overall.
Good.
I agree with
anything different.
I agree with pretty much what everyone has already said about these things. Like we've said it before, C plot really weak in this book. Probably, and I'd say this is probably like one of the weakest C plots I've read in all of Star Wars thus far. Probably the worst one, but that's okay because there were a lot of redeeming qualities to this book, which we talked about. One thing we haven't mentioned yet, or we've mentioned a little bit, are just some of the Easter egg things. I really like that, how they're connections to books, and I guess that's one of Claudia's strengths, is she has her own, like, the Claudia Gray verse with the references that she puts in her own books, but also like the references to like the rest of Star Wars. Credit to all of these authors to tie it back into like the bigger picture, like the station that they're on, the Maxine Station. That's featured in the comic book where Kylo Ren and Snoke go together to meet. Like this serves a purpose later on in the story. And one thing that these writers will do, and it helps that there's direction, to Ted's point earlier, you know, maybe some of the problems with the sequel trilogy is we didn't have the most solid direction going through all three films. But all of these authors went to Lucasfilm, the Skywalker Ranch, and sat down with the story group. Pablo Hidalgo is a character. Actually, he's referenced in this. Did you guys know that's another like reference thing too? Pablo Hidalgo is like an actual character in this book now. I forgot that until this very moment. There's like a character like Paulo like Hildogo or something like that.
Oh no,
I can't remember.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, it was just like a quick reference. I was like, no way, that's definitely like Pablo's like in book reference to it.
That's funny.
But like that's the stuff, because all these people care greatly about Star Wars and like telling the bigger picture, connecting the dots. So to Zach's point earlier, to people who are listening to this right now, if you don't read the books, read them, because they pay off so much for like the little details. You'll pick up on these things if you pay attention, if you put in the time to read them. It's definitely worth it. And although it might not be our favorite book thus far, I'd still recommend reading it. I still like it.
Oh yeah. It's you know, I think especially in this era, you know, with the High Republic, I think all of these major novels are must reads. You know, if you want to keep up with the canon, and you have to read everything, especially in this era. I think there are things that you can skip outside of this, but being so self-contained, it's really important to consume everything that you can. And you know, I'm not a huge comic book reader. And you know, I've kind of struggled through you know, some of them in this in the High Republic, but it's I think it's important, and I've gotten some really valuable content out of them. You know, you can actually take a look at the Star Wars Quick Comics on the Sacred Jedi text channel to keep up with some of that stuff too. So yeah, I agree. You know, I think let's finish up here by saying, you know, I think it's not my favorite Claudia Gray book. I think it's probably towards the bottom of that list. So far it would rank second in my High Republic books out of 2. You know, but there's a lot of good stuff in here. A lot of good stuff, a lot of good character moments, a lot of good character development, world building, and it's all really important. And I hope that it pays off in the future.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, all right, guys. I think that's it for us today. Thank you, Andy and Ted, for joining me. And thank you all for watching or listening wherever you consume this podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening. And I hope you'll join us next time. Follow the podcast on Twitter for updates. You can follow us at Sacred Jedi Text. Follow Andy at Darth Buckman on Twitch. And also check out the Franchise Flicks podcast hosted by Ted, where he is joined by Andy and I to break down movie franchises in their entirety. You can find us there on YouTube and Twitter at Franchise Flicks. Thank you guys again. May the Force be with you.